The Soviets lost the moon race. That's the part you've heard. The part you haven't is that they buried the evidence so thoroughly, so completely, so systematically, that Walter Cronkite went on television in 1974 and announced the race had never happened. For 30 years, almost everyone agreed. They were all wrong. Behind a fence in Kazakhstan, in the dead of winter, the largest rocket the Soviet Union ever built was sitting on a launch pad. Not a rumor, not a legend, a machine. Real steel, real fuel, real ambition. It was called the N-1. It stood taller than a 30-story building. It weighed as much as a naval destroyer fully loaded. It had 30 engines clustered into the base of its first stage, more than any rocket before or since, more than any rocket ever attempted by any nation on Earth. It was designed to do one thing: put a Soviet cosmonaut on the surface of the moon before Neil Armstrong got there. It failed, then it failed again, then twice more after that. And every single time it failed, the Soviet state pretended it had never existed. The launches were erased, the records were sealed, the film footage was classified. The engineers who worked on it were told, in so many words, that they had been building something that officially was not there. This is not a story about rockets. It is a story about what happens when a superpower cannot afford to be honest about losing. In May of 1961, John F. Kennedy stood in front of a joint session of Congress and delivered one of the most consequential sentences in the history of human ambition. He said the United States would commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. At that point, the total accumulated time any American had spent in space was approximately 15 minutes. One suborbital hop by Alan Shepard, barely enough to qualify as spaceflight, barely enough to prove the hardware worked. The Soviets, by contrast, had been dominating space for 4 consecutive years. They had launched the first satellite in October of 1957. They had put the first living creature in orbit in November of that same year. They had sent the first probe to photograph the far side of the moon in 1959. They had put the first human being in orbit, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12, 1961, just 3 weeks before Kennedy's speech. 3 weeks. Kennedy was not challenging an equal. He was challenging a program that had beaten the Americans at every single milestone so far, running on what looked like an unbroken winning streak. And yet the Kremlin watched the Apollo program ramp up and, for 2 full years, decided it was a bluff. Khrushchev was preoccupied with missiles for the military, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, tactical nuclear warheads. These were the things that kept a superpower safe. The civilian space program was a propaganda asset, and propaganda assets do not necessarily require moon rockets. You launch something spectacular, the world applauds, and then you spend the rest of the budget on things that actually kill people. That was the logic. It was catastrophically wrong. By the time the Soviet leadership took the American challenge seriously, in August of 1964, the gap was already structural. 3 years of Apollo funding had poured into NASA. The Saturn V rocket was being designed. The command module and lunar module were under development. The American industrial base, Boeing, North American Aviation, Grumman, Rocketdyne, was churning toward a deadline. The Soviet decree that finally authorized a manned lunar landing was signed in August 1964, 2 months before Khrushchev was removed from power. The Americans had been building their moon rocket for 3 years. The Soviets were starting from a sketch. The man tasked with carrying it out was Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, the architect of Sputnik, Vostok, Voskhod. The man who had put Gagarin in orbit and kept his own name classified for years because the Soviet state didn't want the Americans to know who to target. He was already exhausted. He had been fighting bureaucratic wars and political battles and engineering crises without pause since 1945. He had less than 2 years to live. He did not know that yet. But he was already running on fumes, and the mission he had just been handed required a miracle. Korolev had wanted to build a heavy launch vehicle since 1956. His earliest internal sketches imagined something he called the super rocket, a 2,000-ton machine with 66 engines in its first stage and a nuclear-powered second stage. The nuclear upper stage idea was abandoned by 1959 when studies showed that conventional chemical propellants could achieve nearly the same performance without the political toxicity of flying a reactor over populated areas. What survived from those early sketches was the fundamental configuration: a monolithic first stage, a cluster of medium-thrust engines, liquid oxygen, and kerosene. By 1962, Korolev's design bureau, OKB-1, had completed a draft project for a rocket they were now calling the N-1. The design described a vehicle with a liftoff mass of 2,200 metric tons, a payload capacity of 75 tons to low Earth orbit, and 24 engines on its first stage. Official approval to begin construction came in September of that year. The first launch, the decree confidently promised, would happen in 1965. It did not happen in 1966 either. The architecture Korolev eventually chose for the actual lunar mission was called the N-1L3 complex. One enormous rocket would carry a 2-spacecraft payload, an orbiter called the Soyuz 7K LOK, and a lander called the LK. One cosmonaut would ride the orbiter to lunar orbit. One cosmonaut would descend to the surface. The Americans were planning to send 2 people to the surface. The Soviets, constrained by the capacity of a single launch, could only afford 1. The single launch architecture assumed that everything would work. Every stage would fire. Every separation event would happen on schedule. The lander, the LK, was a remarkable piece of engineering compressed into the smallest possible package. But it had no seat inside it. The cosmonaut would stand at the controls during descent, braced against straps, watching the lunar surface rise up through a periscope. There was no internal tunnel between the lander and the orbiter, the way Apollo's docking port allowed the crew to move between ships in shirt sleeves. The Soviet cosmonaut, if he reached the surface and completed his moonwalk, would have to climb back into the LK, reach lunar orbit, then exit the lander in a spacesuit, float across the gap between the 2 spacecraft, and climb into the orbiter through an external hatch. In vacuum, alone, 384,000 kilometers from Earth. None of this was reckless in the stupid sense. It was what fit on top of one rocket. Every design decision cascaded from that single constraint. The rocket was the constraint, and the rocket was the problem. The N-1 had been designed in a rush, on a budget that was always too small, by a man who hated the engineer who would have built him better engines. That sentence is not metaphor. It is the precise technical and personal history of why the N-1 never reached the moon. Korolev refused to work with Valentin Glushko. Glushko was the Soviet Union's foremost rocket engine designer, the man behind the engines that powered virtually every successful Soviet launch vehicle. His RD-107 and RD-108 engines had carried Sputnik. His engines had carried Gagarin. His engines would go on, decades later, to carry the Soyuz capsules that still reach the International Space Station today. He was, without serious argument, the best in the field. Korolev refused to use him because Glushko had written a letter to the NKVD in 1938, during Stalin's Great Purge, denouncing Korolev for wrecking activities. Korolev was arrested. He was interrogated, convicted in a show trial, and sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian labor camp. He spent time in the Kolyma gold mines, some of the most brutal conditions in the entire Gulag system, where life expectancy in the late 1930s was measured not in years, but in months. He lost teeth from scurvy. He nearly died. He survived only because his engineering skills were useful to the state, and he was eventually transferred to a sharashka, a prison design bureau, where he worked in chains, literally in chains at certain periods, on Soviet aircraft and rocket designs. He spent 6 years in the Gulag system. He was not fully rehabilitated until 1957. He never forgot what Glushko had done. He never forgave it. So when it came time to build the engines for the Soviet moon rocket, Korolev turned to a man named Nikolai Kuznetsov, whose design bureau had spent the previous 20 years building turboprop engines for Soviet military aircraft. Kuznetsov had never built a large liquid fuel rocket engine before. He agreed to try. The result was an engine called the NK-15. It was clever. It was efficient by the standards of the era. Each one produced approximately 150 tons of thrust, about 1/5 the thrust of a single American F-1 engine. And the N-1 needed 30 of them, all firing simultaneously, all synchronized, all of them never having been tested together in a full-scale ground test stand, because there was no money to build one. The first time all 30 engines would fire together would be on the launch pad, pointed at the sky, with a cosmonaut's eventual life riding on the outcome. Glushko, for his part, had offered an alternative. He proposed using larger engines, fewer of them, burning nitrogen tetroxide and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, a combination of storable propellants that were easier to keep in the tank for extended periods. These fuels had real advantages in some operational scenarios, but they were also deeply toxic. They were corrosive. They produced roughly 20% less specific impulse than the liquid oxygen and kerosene that Korolev preferred, meaning they were less efficient per kilogram of propellant burned. And they smelled, when leaked, like the inside of a chemical weapon. Korolev refused. Glushko, in retaliation, refused to develop a large kerosene-burning engine for the N-1. It was a personal vendetta wrapped inside a technical disagreement, and the outcome was that the most important rocket in Soviet history was built with engines designed by a man whose previous experience was propeller aircraft, because the man who could have done it better had written a letter in 1938. The grudge was, in a literal engineering sense, a design constraint. A small institute within the Soviet space industry called Tisnai-Mash was assigned the task of calculating the probability that the first N-1 launch would succeed. They approached this systematically. They looked at the failure record of every Soviet rocket and missile ever built. They analyzed failure modes. They ran the numbers. The probability of complete mission success came out to just over 1%. 1%. The man who ran Tisnai-Mash, Yuri Mojorin, stared at that number and understood immediately that he could not present it to the Politburo. 1% was not a launch recommendation. 1% was a program cancellation recommendation. So he ordered his analysts to recalculate, this time excluding any failures caused by manufacturing defects or operator error. Only failures resulting from previously unknown physics would count. Failures that no engineer could have anticipated. The new number came back at 67%. He presented the 67% number. The room went silent. Even with the massaged figure, no rational engineer operating in a normal industrial context would authorize a launch with a 33% chance of catastrophic failure. A commercial airline that lost 1 in 3 aircraft would be grounded in the first week. A pharmaceutical company that killed 1 in 3 patients would face criminal prosecution. But this was not a commercial airline. This was the Soviet space program, and the Americans were coming. Nikolai Pilyugin, head of the N-1 flight control system, was the first to speak after the silence. He proposed abandoning the statistical approach altogether. The only legitimate criterion for a launch decision, he argued, was the personal assurance of every chief designer that his specific subsystem would work. If every chief designer could stand up and say his system was ready, then the rocket was ready. Statistics were irrelevant. The room agreed. Majoran agreed fastest of all, because it meant his organization would no longer be held responsible if something went wrong. The decision to launch the N1 was not, in the end, a decision based on engineering. It was a decision based on a pool of men who could not afford to say no. There was no time. Apollo 8 had just gone around the moon in December 1968, proving that the Americans intended to land within months. The window was closing, so they launched anyway. That brings us to February 21st, 1969, Vehicle 3L, the first N1 test flight. It was 44 degrees below 0 Celsius on the step. The wind was strong enough to knock a man off his feet. The launch pad area had been evacuated to a safe perimeter. 50 railway tank cars had spent days transferring 2,000 tons of liquid oxygen and kerosene into the rocket's fuel tanks. The countdown reached 0, and the 30 engines of the first stage began their ignition sequence. It took 12 full seconds for the combined thrust to build to a level sufficient to lift the vehicle off the pad. Then it rose. Slow at first, stately even, the way all large rockets move at liftoff, fighting their own mass. It climbed into a clear blue Kazakh sky on a pillar of fire and black smoke that stretched for hundreds of meters below it. The sound arrived at the observation posts several seconds after the visual, a physical roar that witnesses described as something you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. For 60 seconds, it looked like history, like a Soviet cosmonaut was going to the moon. About 55 seconds after liftoff, a fire started in the tail compartment. Here is the precise sequence of what happened, reconstructed from the post-flight investigation. Approximately 6 seconds after liftoff, a small pressure-sensing tube inside engine number 2 failed due to high-frequency vibration, the same kind of resonance that shatters wine glasses, but applied to metal tubing carrying rocket propellant under extreme pressure. About 25 seconds in, a fuel feed pipe on the same engine broke off, spraying kerosene into the base of the rocket. Hot exhaust gases from the neighboring engines ignited the spray. A fire began. The fire melted the insulation on the wiring of the cord system, the automated engine management computer that monitored all 30 engines for signs of malfunction. The melted wiring sent false electrical signals through Cord's circuitry. Cord interpreted these signals as simultaneous catastrophic failure of every engine on the vehicle. In response, exactly as it had been programmed, it shut them all down at once, at 68.7 seconds into the flight. Here is what makes this particular failure so cruel. The rocket had not actually failed. The engines were still running. The vehicle was still flying. But the system designed to protect it from failure had been tricked into killing it by a fire that started in a broken pipe. Cord had not malfunctioned. It had functioned perfectly, and the function it performed was the destruction of its own rocket. The same shutdown command propagated upward to the second and third stages, leaving the entire vehicle dead in the air, coasting on momentum for a few seconds more before beginning to fall. The British picked up the launch attempt through their intelligence networks. The Americans, who had spy satellites over the Baikonur Cosmodrome, somehow failed to detect the launch, an intelligence failure that would contribute to years of public confusion about whether it had happened at all. The Soviets said nothing. The pre-launch press release plan, prepared weeks earlier by propaganda official Georgy Tulin, had 3 versions ready for 3 different outcomes. None of them mentioned the moon. The official policy of the Soviet Union was that there was no moon program. There never had been. The N1 was, depending on which version of the cover story you encountered, either a research vehicle, a heavy scientific satellite launcher, or simply a thing that did not exist. The rocket crashed 52 kilometers from the pad in the snow. It had flown for less than 70 seconds. By the spring of 1969, the schedule was beyond saving. And Korolev, the one man who might have found a way to force a solution through sheer political will and engineering stubbornness, had been dead for 3 years. He had died on January 14, 1966, on an operating table in Moscow. The official story was routine surgery for a polyp in his colon. The actual story was worse. The surgeon operating on him, the Soviet Minister of Health, Boris Petrovsky, who had personally taken on the case, discovered during the procedure that the polyp was actually a large malignant tumor. The surgery, which should have taken an hour, lasted 8 hours. Korolev's cardiovascular system, weakened by years of privation in the labor camps, the cold, the scurvy, the physical abuse, the chronic stress, could not sustain the procedure. His heart stopped. They could not resuscitate him. He was 59 years old. The Soviet state, which had kept his name classified for decades, gave him a state funeral. His ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall alongside the ashes of cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, who would die a year later when his Soyuz capsule's parachute failed. The 2 men who had built the Soviet space program and the man who had flown it, all dead before the moon race was over. Korolev's replacement was Vasily Mishin. Mishin was a competent engineer, technically sound, loyal to the program, but he had none of Korolev's political instincts. Korolev had operated in the brutal ecosystem of Soviet bureaucracy for 30 years. He knew which threats to make, which favors to call in, which general to call at 3 in the morning when a shipment of components was being held up in Kyiv. Mishin did not have those tools. He couldn't motivate the workforce the way Korolev had. He couldn't extract resources from the state the way Korolev had. He couldn't, when the moment came, persuade a skeptical Politburo to keep funding a program that was visibly, expensively, catastrophically failing. The second N1, Vehicle 5L, was the moment everything ended. The Americans had flown Apollo 9 in March 1969, testing the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 had flown in May, taking the lunar module to within 15 kilometers of the lunar surface, a dress rehearsal so close that the astronauts could see individual craters. Apollo 11 was scheduled for July. The window was almost gone. The Soviets had 1 card left to play. If they could launch 5L in early July, they could at minimum send the spacecraft on a loop around the moon and return it. Not a landing, but a dramatic demonstration. Simultaneously, a smaller robotic probe called Luna 15, launched on a Proton rocket, would land on the moon, collect a sample of lunar soil, and return it to Earth. If Luna 15 succeeded, the Soviets could claim with a straight face that they had beaten the Americans to a lunar sample return mission. It would not be a manned landing, but it would steal something from the moment. It might let them maintain, barely, the fiction that they had never been competing for the manned landing at all. Vehicle 5L was rolled out to the same launch pad in late June. The engineers had made modifications based on the investigation of 3L. The cord system had been moved out of the engine compartment, where it had been vulnerable to fire, into the safer intertank section between stages. Ventilation openings had been cut into the engine compartment walls to improve cooling. Filters had been installed on the propellant lines to catch metallic debris before it could enter the turbopumps. The modifications had been made in a rush, often using hand-annotated engineering sketches rather than completed technical drawings. 3 shifts of workers had worked around the clock for months. The launch was set for the night of July 3, 1969, 2 weeks before Apollo 11. What happened next was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in the history of human spaceflight. The rocket lifted off normally at 23:18 local time. For a quarter of a second, it looked exactly like a successful launch. Then a small piece of metallic debris, a fragment no larger than a coin, was ingested by the oxidizer pump of engine number 8. The pump exploded. The explosion propagated. A fire ignited at the base of the rocket as it rose past the top of the launch tower, still accelerating upward, flames already consuming its belly. Cord responded this time correctly. It began shutting down engines in pairs, following its programmed response to fire. The thrust dropped. The vehicle, now weighing more than the remaining engines could lift, slowed. It hung in the air for a terrible moment, tilted at roughly 45 degrees, and began to fall back toward the pad. The escape tower at the top of the rocket, a thin spike of solid rocket motors designed for exactly this scenario, fired. It yanked the empty crew capsule away from the vehicle, arcing it clear of the explosion zone. There was no crew aboard. The capsule survived. Everything else did not. The vehicle, carrying roughly 2,300 tons of liquid oxygen and kerosene, hit the launch complex. The fireball was visible from the horizon. Witnesses who had not evacuated to safe distances described the ground shaking, the air pressure changing, windows shattering in buildings kilometers away. One account compared it to a small nuclear detonation, not metaphorically, but in terms of the physical sensation of standing too close to it. The launch tower, which had taken years to construct, was destroyed. The launch pad itself was obliterated. The structures around it were flattened or burned. American weather satellites and reconnaissance satellites detected the event within hours. CIA analysts studying the imagery understood what had happened. Within days, the American intelligence community had a detailed picture of the disaster. The damage to the launch complex was so severe that engineers estimated it would take 18 months to repair. The Soviet-manned lunar program, in that single quarter second when a coin-sized fragment entered the wrong pump, was effectively over. Not administratively canceled, not slowly defunded, destroyed, as thoroughly as if someone had detonated a bomb at the center of it. 3 weeks later, on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed in the Sea of Tranquility. At almost the same moment, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on the lunar surface, while hundreds of millions of people around the world were watching a grainy black and white television image of a man from Earth standing on the moon, Luna 15 was making its descent attempt. The small Soviet robot probe, the last card in a losing hand, fired its braking engine and began to drop toward the surface of a region of the moon called the Sea of Crises. It crashed. Mission failure. The Sea of Tranquility and the Sea of Crises are approximately 1,000 kilometers apart on the lunar surface. Apollo 11 landed in one. Luna 15 crashed into the other. That fact is not a metaphor. That fact is geography. But it would take a very cold novelist to resist what it implies. The Soviets said nothing. Officially, Luna 15 had been a routine, unmanned science mission. Officially, the N1 program did not exist. The footage of the explosion was classified. The records of the launch were sealed. Reconnaissance photographs of the devastated launch pad were the best evidence available to Western analysts, and even those were interpreted cautiously because the Soviets had gone to considerable lengths to obscure what had happened. This is the part that takes a moment to absorb. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in American television news, the anchor who had narrated the space race for CBS, told American audiences in 1974 that the Russians had never been in the moon race at all. The London Sunday Times had written the same thing in 1971. The New York Times had said it in 1964. By 1989, NBC News was producing anniversary specials narrated by Leonard Nimoy that flatly stated the space race had not been a race, that the Soviets had lacked the intent, the capability, and the infrastructure to compete. None of these journalists were lying. They did not know what had happened on the steppe of Kazakhstan. They were reporting what the available evidence supported, and the available evidence had been carefully curated by a state that had spent decades becoming very good at making things disappear. The Soviets had buried the footage so completely, had maintained the denial so consistently that the Americans who had won the race started to doubt there had ever been a contest. A standard Western narrative settled in by the mid-1970s, the one that said the Soviets had lost interest in the moon by 1963, that the race was a bureaucratic invention by NASA to justify its budget, that the whole competition had been theater staged by Kennedy's speechwriters. The reality was the exact opposite. The Soviets had been working as hard as they could. They had been failing in private, on a scale, at a cost, and with a desperation that would have ended any open democratic program before it began. And they had been lying about it consistently, systematically, and with a sophistication that, in retrospect, deserves a kind of dark admiration for its sheer audacity. What makes the N1 program strange is not that it failed. Rockets fail. The history of rocketry is a history of explosions, one after another, edging incrementally toward success. What makes the N1 strange is the specific texture of how it failed. The particular combination of political cowardice, institutional dysfunction, and personal vendetta that shaped every bad decision. Compare it briefly to its American counterpart. The Saturn V was built by NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center under the direction of Wernher von Braun, the German rocket engineer who had built the V-2 missile for Nazi Germany and been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Whatever you think of von Braun's history, and it is a complicated history involving the use of slave labor that history has not fully reckoned with, as an engineer leading a program, he was exceptional. The Saturn V used 5 F-1 engines in its first stage. Each one produced approximately 700 tons of thrust, making each individual F-1 more powerful than the entire first stage of many other rockets. There were 5 of them, total, 5. Rocketdyne, the company that built the F-1, spent years solving the problem of combustion instability in large rocket engines, a phenomenon where resonant pressure waves inside the combustion chamber can tear an engine apart in fractions of a second. They detonated small explosive charges inside running engines to test stability margins. They ran thousands of tests. They understood the failure modes before the rocket flew. 32 Saturn rockets of various types were launched during the Apollo program. Not one of them failed catastrophically. The contrast with the N1 is almost surgical. 5 large engines, exhaustively tested individually and in clusters, with deep institutional understanding of their failure modes, versus 30 smaller engines, never tested as a system, with failure modes that only became visible during flight. The Americans tested obsessively on the ground. The Soviets tested the only way they had left, in the air. But the technical divergence was itself a symptom of a deeper institutional difference. The Americans had a single coordinating organization called NASA, with one administrator, one chain of command, one budget allocation process, one set of program goals. When George Mueller decided in 1963 to restructure the Saturn program around the all-up testing philosophy, launching complete rockets rather than testing stage by stage, the entire organization oriented itself to that decision. There was friction, but there was also compliance. The chain of command functioned. The Soviets had 4 competing design bureaus, run by 4 men who despised each other. Korolev at OKB-1, Glushko at OKB-456, Mikhail Yangel at OKB-586, Vladimir Chalome at OKB-52. Each one wanted to build the moon rocket. Each one had political patrons in different corners of the Soviet government. Each one, at various points, proposed alternative designs that would have made his bureau the primary contractor and sidelined the others. Yangel proposed a rocket called the R-56, a heavy-lift vehicle using clustered rocket modules that could be shipped by rail to Baikonur and assembled at the launch site. Chalome proposed the UR-700, an even larger design using Glushko's storable propellants. Both vehicles, in standard engineering analysis, were more conservative approaches than the N1. Both avoided the reliability problems that would ultimately doom the N1. Neither was ever built, because building one of them would have meant giving political ground to Yangel or Chelomey, and Korolev was not going to do that. The Soviet space program spent years in a kind of slow-motion civil war between its chief designers. And the war was settled, again and again, not by engineering analysis, not by comparative testing, not by any rational performance metric, but by political maneuvering, by who had whose ear in the Kremlin that month, by personal loyalty and personal rivalry encoded into institutional structure. In August of 1964, when the lunar landing assignment was finally given to Korolev, 3 different rockets were under active consideration for the same mission. By the time the N1 was definitively chosen, the Americans had already begun fabricating hardware for the Saturn V. The decision that cost the Soviets 3 years of design competition had cost the Americans nothing, because the Americans were not having the same competition. There were 2 more launches after 5L. The program, though functionally dead, continued to consume resources and human effort for another 3 years, because no one with authority had the political courage to officially cancel it. The 3rd launch came in June of 1971. Vehicle 6L had been substantially redesigned. Filters had been added to the propellant feed lines. The tail aerodynamics had been modified. The entire vehicle had been painted white to reduce heat absorption during summer operations. Most importantly, a new post-liftoff trajectory had been programmed into the guidance system, a sharp roll maneuver designed to push the rocket away from the launch pad immediately after clearing the tower, to prevent a repeat of the 5L catastrophe. The maneuver worked too well. As the rocket cleared the tower and began its programmed roll, the combined exhaust dynamics of 30 engines interacting with the rocket's own slipstream generated an unplanned torque. The vehicle began to spin around its long axis. The control system, already at the limits of its response bandwidth, could not compensate. The spin accelerated, about 50 seconds into the flight, as the vehicle passed through the region of maximum aerodynamic stress, the point where dynamic pressure is highest and structural loads peak. The aerodynamic forces on a spinning rocket are no longer symmetric. They are tearing. Range safety destroyed the vehicle before it could reach populated areas. The 4th and final launch came in November of 1972, Vehicle 7L. By this point, 3 years after the Apollo 11 landing, the race was not just over. It had been over so long that Apollo 17 would leave the moon before the year was out. But the engineers pressed on, because they still believed the problems were solvable, because the improved NK-33 and NK-43 engines on this vehicle had passed their ground tests, and because stopping felt like admitting the whole thing had been wasted. 7L flew for 107 seconds, the longest flight in the program's history. It very nearly reached first stage separation. Then a planned shutdown of 6 central engines, programmed to reduce structural loads on the vehicle as propellant mass decreased, caused a hydraulic hammer effect in the propellant feed lines. A fuel line ruptured. The oxidizer pump on engine number 4 exploded. The vehicle disintegrated at altitude, debris raining down on the empty step below. The engineers argued for months afterward about who was responsible. Mishin blamed the engine designers. The engine designers blamed the propellant system design. Everyone agreed, in retrospect, that if the central engines had simply been left to burn to depletion, if the programmed shutdown had never been initiated, the first stage might have completed its burn successfully. The modification that destroyed the rocket had been intended to protect it. The epilogue is almost too bitter to describe. 2 more N1 rockets, vehicles 8L and 9L, were fully assembled and sitting in the integration building when the program was canceled. Their NK-33 engines had completed extensive and largely successful ground testing. The redesigned propellant systems had incorporated the lessons of every previous failure. Several of the engineers who had worked on the program believed, with a confidence bordering on certainty, that the next launch would have worked. They never found out. In May of 1974, Mishin was removed from his position as chief designer and replaced by Valentin Glushko. The same Valentin Glushko who had denounced Korolev in 1938. The same man Korolev had refused to work with. Given control of the design bureau that had excluded him for 3 decades, Glushko did what anyone who understood the psychology of that situation would have predicted. He canceled the N1 program entirely. The 2 assembled rockets were ordered dismantled. The manufacturing tooling was scrapped. The program records were reclassified. The N1 was, once again, a thing that had never existed. The fuel tanks from the dismantled rockets were taken to the Baikonur Cosmodrome grounds. Workers used them as carports and storage sheds. The payload shrouds, enormous curved metal sections designed to protect spacecraft during launch, were repurposed as shade structures over picnic areas. The hardware of the Soviet moon program became lawn furniture. But there were 150 engines in a warehouse. NK-15 and NK-33 series engines, the ones Kuznetsov's factory had produced for the canceled program, stored in sealed containers at a facility in the Volga region. The order from Glushko was to destroy them. Kuznetsov did not destroy them. He had spent his career building those engines. They were the only large rocket engines he had ever built. He sealed the warehouse, locked the doors, and walked away. For 20 years, those engines sat in a warehouse that officially did not contain anything worth knowing about. 20 years later, after the Soviet Union had dissolved and the Russian space industry was looking for hard currency wherever it could find it, an American aerospace company called Aerojet purchased a batch of those warehoused engines. They were redesignated the AJ-26 for American documentation purposes. They were transported to test facilities in the United States. They were tested. They worked. The engines designed in the 1960s by a man who had never built a large rocket engine before, for a program his country had officially denied, sealed in a warehouse for 2 decades, and then sold to the country that had won the race. They worked. The AJ-26 was subsequently selected for use on the Antares rocket, a launch vehicle operated by Orbital Sciences, later Northrop Grumman, to supply the International Space Station under NASA's Commercial Resupply Services program. Soviet NK-33 derivatives were flying American cargo to the American space station. The engines from the buried program were, in a sense, reaching orbit at last. There was one dramatic test stand failure during their American service career in 2014, and an in-flight failure that destroyed an Antares rocket and its cargo shortly after launch. The precise cause of the in-flight failure remains contested in the technical literature. Aerojet attributed it to a turbopump issue, while others pointed to the interaction of aging components with decades of storage. What is not contested is that the engines flew, that they had been designed right underneath all the political failure and institutional dysfunction that had surrounded them. The engineering had been sound. The program that contained it had not been. There are things we still do not know about the N1 program, and some of them we may never know. We do not know how many people died. The accident records, both from the launches themselves and from the years of ground testing, component failures, and propellant handling incidents, were classified. Many have not been declassified. The Soviet space program had a complex relationship with its human cost. Komarov's death in 1967 was acknowledged, eventually. The deaths of the Soyuz 11 crew in 1971, 3 cosmonauts who suffocated when a pressure equalization valve opened during re-entry, were acknowledged. The broader casualty record of the N1 program, the technicians and engineers and soldiers who worked at the launch complex, the people who lived near the propellant storage facilities. That record is still largely invisible. We do not know whether Vehicle 8L, assembled and ready to fly when the program was canceled, would have succeeded. The engineers who built it believed it would. The improved engines had passed their ground tests. The redesigned propellant systems had addressed the failure modes identified in previous flights. But engineers who build things always believe in them. That is a psychological prerequisite of engineering, not a technical guarantee. We do not know what the cosmonauts who trained for the lunar landing were told, or when they were told it. Alexei Leonov, the first human being to walk in space, the man who had been selected as the prime candidate for the Soviet lunar landing, trained on LK lander simulators for years. He flew helicopters that replicated the lander's descent profile. He studied lunar geology. He was told, year after year, that the next launch would be the one. The cosmonaut training group for the lunar program was officially dissolved in October 1973. None of those men ever went to the moon. Some spoke about it in interviews after the Soviet collapse, but most of what they said was careful, measured. They had spent years preparing for a mission that, as far as the official record showed, had never been planned. To speak too directly about it was still, in some ways, to accuse the state of lying, and the state had not finished existing yet. What is left of the N1 program today is mostly silence and rust. The launch complexes at Baikonur are crumbling. The roof of the massive vehicle assembly building, one of the largest enclosed structures ever built in Central Asia, has partially collapsed. The apartment blocks where the program's workers lived are empty, windows gone, interiors open to the weather. A few NK-15 engines are in museums, one in a display case at a Russian aviation museum, several at the Baikonur Cosmodrome Museum, where visitors can walk up to them and touch the bell-shaped nozzles and try to imagine 30 of them firing at once. A handful of LK lander prototypes survive, scattered across Russia in technology institutes and aviation museums. They are small spacecraft, roughly 5 meters tall, designed to carry one man to the surface of another world. None of them ever carried a person anywhere. They sit in display cases under fluorescent lights. The film footage of the 4 N1 launches, classified for 30 years, was released in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the Soviet Union disintegrated and its secrets came loose. It is grainy. It is silent. No sound recorded, or the sound recordings classified separately and never found. It shows a very large rocket rising into a very clear Central Asian sky, and then, in 4 separate films across 4 separate years, falling back down. Each failure is slightly different. Each one gets a little further. The 4th one makes it almost to the end before it comes apart. There is something specific about watching it now, with the knowledge of everything that surrounded it. The rockets in the footage do not look like they are about to fail. They rise with the same confidence as any successful rocket. The exhaust plumes are clean and bright. The vehicle configuration looks right. For the first 60 seconds, or 50 seconds, or 107 seconds, you cannot see the thing that is going to kill it. You cannot tell the difference, from the outside, between a rocket that is going to the moon and a rocket that is going to disintegrate over a frozen steppe. That, in a way, is what the Soviets were burying. Not the failures themselves, not the hardware, not the footage, not the records, although they buried all of those too. What they were burying was the fact that the failures had been, until the last moment, indistinguishable from success, that they had come so close, that a different decision in 1938, Glushko not writing a letter, Korolev not being arrested, might have changed the engines, and different engines might have changed the rocket, and a different rocket might have put a Soviet flag on the moon a year before Armstrong. That all of it, the whole 30-year arc from the first Sputnik to the last N1 disintegrating in the November sky, had been contingent on things as small as a personal grudge and a piece of metal the size of a coin. History tends to feel inevitable in retrospect. The winner looks like the winner. The loser looks like someone who could never have won. That feeling is almost always wrong. The Sea of Tranquility is a real place on the moon. The Sea of Crises is a real place on the moon. They are approximately 1,000 kilometers apart, separated by high ground and ancient impact basins, two dark plains of solidified lava that formed 4 billion years ago when the solar system was young. Apollo 11 landed in one of them on July 20th, 1969. Luna 15 crashed into the other on July 21st, 1969. They are still there. The landing stage of the Apollo 11 lunar module, the descent stage that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin left behind, is still there, slowly accumulating micrometeorite impacts and cosmic radiation damage. The American flag long since bleached white by decades of ultraviolet from an unfiltered sun. The debris of Luna 15, scattered across the surface on impact, is still there too, somewhere in the Sea of Crises. The N1 rocket no longer exists in any form. The engines in museums are the closest thing that survives. The program that built them was erased so thoroughly that for decades the people who had lost the race convinced the people who had won it that there had been no race at all. That erasure was, in its own terrible way, a kind of achievement. It takes an enormous amount of work to make something that large disappear. It takes institutions and procedures and the cooperation, willing or coerced, of thousands of people who all agree, day after day, to describe the thing they saw as a thing they didn't see. The Soviet Union did that. For 30 years, it maintained a fiction about one of the most expensive and consequential engineering failures in its history, and then it ran out of time to maintain fictions about anything. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content, and this is exactly the kind of buried history that deserves to be found. Subscribe if you want to see more, because there is a great deal more. The 20th century is full of things that happened in buildings where no cameras were allowed, in programs that officially didn't exist, in the minds of engineers who were told that the numbers they calculated were the wrong numbers. The stories are there, we just have to go looking for them. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next